Good afternoon. My name is Dara Hankins, and I'd like to introduce everyone to Kyle Walker, our fabulous pianist for today. He's one of my favorite people to perform with, and we are so lucky that he will be joining us. During today's presentation, Kyle will be performing several pieces written by Thomas Wiggins. In an incredibly fortuitous discovery, I stumbled upon Geneva Handy Southall's book, Blind Tom, the Black Pianist-Composer Continually Enslaved. I was at my parents' house for the holidays and found it nestled on the shelf in between a biography about Tchaikovsky and a Toyota Celica manual. This book is the third volume in Southall's series about Blind Tom. Reading this book was enlightening, and I learned so much before I even got into the main text of the story. When I read the unbelievable summary of this book, I was hooked, and I knew I had to read it. Here are some quotes that grabbed my attention. At the same time that Verdi, Liszt, Wagner, and Brahms were writing music in Europe, there existed a musical prodigy in his own right, who embodied the numerous fractures of American society in the 19th century. Blind Tom was the stage name of Thomas Green Wiggins, a blind pianist born into slavery in 1849. His programs included works by Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, Liszt, Thalberg, and other European masters. He improvised on operatic tunes and popular ballads, as well as performed several of his own published and unpublished compositions. He could perform difficult pieces after one hearing, sing and recite poetry or prose in several languages, duplicate lengthy orations, and imitate the sounds of nature, machinery, and various musical instruments. Today, Kyle and I are pleased to introduce you to Thomas Green Wiggins, known as Blind Tom. Blind Tom is considered by many to be the most celebrated Black concert artist of the 19th century. Unfortunately, he's virtually unknown today. As a part of our Black History series, I will be presenting historical highlights about his life, and Kyle will be performing some of Blind Tom's original compositions that showcase his genius. By the end of our presentation of Facts and Music, you will come to know Thomas Green Wiggins, and we hope that this will inspire you to learn more about his story. Thomas Green Wiggins was born on the Wiley Edward Jones plantation in Harris County, Georgia, on May 25, 1849. He came into the world blind and autistic. Before the age of 2, Tom was purchased, along with his parents, by General James Neal Bethune, a prominent Georgia lawyer and anti-abolitionist. It was soon discovered that Tom had a flawless memory and a keen aptitude for music. He would echo the sounds around him, repeating accurately the crow of a rooster or the singing of a bird. Thunderstorms, in particular, were a favorite sound. By age 4, Tom could repeat conversations up to 10 minutes in length, but otherwise appeared to have limited communication capability when it came to communicating his own needs. He would often resort to grunts and gestures. At age 5, Tom was composing his own pieces, and by age 8, his owner, General Bethune, was exhibiting him around the state of Georgia as, quote, Mozart-like. When Tom was 10, General Bethune hired him out to Perry Oliver, a Savannah planter. Court records from 1865 show that Perry Oliver made $50,000 exhibiting Tom and had paid a $15,000 fee to General Bethune for the right to do so. After several concerts in Savannah, Georgia, Perry Oliver began touring with Tom in other Southern and pro-slavery states. He billed the performances as, quote, the musical prodigy of the age, a plantation Negro boy. The outbreak of the Civil War caused Perry Oliver to cancel the rest of Tom's northern concert engagements, and they returned to Georgia, where Perry Oliver continued to make use of Tom's talents for the financial benefit of the Confederacy. Tom toured extensively in the U.S., performing as often as 4 times a day, and earning Oliver and Bethune up to $100,000 a year. That was an enormous sum of money for the time, and was the equivalent to $1.5 million a year in 2004. Blind Tom was the 19th century's most highly compensated pianist. General Bethune's family eventually made a fortune estimated at $750,000 at the hands of Blind Tom. Perry Oliver marketed Tom as a Barnum-style freak, advertising the transformation from animal to artist. In the media, Tom was frequently compared to a bear, baboon, or mastiff, which is a breed of dog. Tom was not a bear, or baboon, or mastiff. He was an incredibly talented human being, as demonstrated by one of his earliest compositions entitled The Rainstorm. Tom was fascinated with the piano and would compose original songs that would mimic the sounds of nature, animals, and other musical instruments. At the age of 5, he gave his first performance of The Rainstorm, which he said, quote, was what the wind, thunder, and rain said to me. Now, we would have loved for Kyle to be able to perform The Rainstorm for you today, but unfortunately, we were unable to get our hands on the sheet music. And I will share a link to a recording on YouTube during the Q&A so that you can hear this piece. But at this time, Kyle will perform another lovely piece that Tom wrote entitled March Timpani. Kyle will also speak to the challenges of finding Tom's music, and he will introduce you to the piece that he will perform.
Thanks, Dara. So this is a piece called March Timpani by Blind Tom Wiggins, and the way that I found this piece is actually on a website called blindtom.org, which has a good bit of his other sheet music available, but there are also some links that don't really lead to anywhere. So unfortunately, his music, even though it's becoming a little bit more known, is still very hard to find. However, I'm very glad to share this one with you called March Timpani.
By 1861, Tom's reputation was of such high standing that he was featured in a private concert held at Willard Hall in Washington, D.C. to honor the first visiting Japanese delegation to this country. His Baltimore concerts of July 1860 had so impressed the famous piano manufacturer William Knabe that he gave the 10-year-old slave an elaborately carved rosewood grand piano with a silver plate bearing the inscription, quote, "A tribute to genius," end quote. Tom was also a published composer by this time. In 1862, the Bethunes began to use Tom's talents for the pro-slavery cause. Many black newspapers refused to celebrate Tom because they felt he was only reinforcing negative stereotypes about African American individuals, and that he was a source of profit for slaveholders. Nevertheless, Tom composed Battle of Manassas at the age of 12, and this piece remains one of the great battle pieces of any period. This work was conceived after he heard one of Colonel Bethune's sons, a member of the 2nd Georgia Regiment, give a first-hand description of the famous Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run. Battle of Manassas became Tom Wiggins's most popular composition. You will hear a complete performance of the Battle of Manassas as the finale of this presentation. And now we get to the part where, this book kind of gets its title, which is Continually Enslaved. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its 3rd year of civil war. The proclamation declared, quote, that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free, end quote. In spite of the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, General Bethune did not allow Tom Wiggins to go free. He retained control of Com and his career as his property, thus continually enslaving Tom. General Bethune coerced Tom's parents into signing an indentured servant agreement, binding their son to the Bethune family for another 5 years in exchange for services rendered. General Bethune's guardianship was challenged in 1865 by a show business promoter known as the, quote, Barnum of the African race, but the judge ruled in favor of General Bethune, who retained guardianship of Tom. Tom's many concerts and the sale of his sheet music continued to earn fabulous sums of money. Tom then traveled abroad and made a splash during his first European tour. Professional musicians of international standing heaped praise on Tom, including Ignaz Moscheles, the Czech pianist who was a friend to Beethoven, teacher of Mendelssohn, and a rival of Liszt. Tom also made an impression on Charles Hall, the highly respected German pianist and conductor, and the first person to perform all 32 Beethoven piano sonatas. Tom returned to the United States 1 year later with these glowing testimonials in hand, and he had also made the Bethune family $100,000 richer. By age 16, Tom's repertoire included many of the most technically and musically demanding works of Bach, Chopin, Liszt, Beethoven, Thalberg, and other European masters. Tom had the amazing ability to perform difficult selections almost flawlessly after one hearing. Quote, his concerts nearly always featured a challenge in which a member of the audience was invited to the stage to play anything he liked, preferably an original work. No matter what it was, Wiggins would play it right back, fumbles and all, end quote. Tom could sing, recite poetry and prose in several languages, and duplicate phonetically lengthy orations by noted statesmen. One report from the Atlanta Southern Confederacy noted that Tom played Dixie with one hand, Yankee Doodle in the other, all while singing The Girl I Left Behind Me at the same time. Eventually, Tom's repertoire grew to an astounding 7,000 established works. He composed over 100 works himself. And at this time, Kyle will now introduce and perform two pieces from Tom's extensive body of work.
And speaking of the European composers that he played a lot of, this next piece is called Sewing Song, which reminds me kind of like a Chopin etude, which would be a very musical exercise for our hands, kind of like this. But the title Sewing Song kind of reminds me of another piece by a different composer, Franz Schubert, who wrote this piece called Gretchen am Spinnrad, which is also about a spinning wheel. And it has a lot of repetition in the right hand, which is sort of like what you would find in an exercise or an etude. So this is Wiggins' very musical example of an etude. This is called the Sewing Song. So as you can tell, that was an etude more or less for the right hand mostly, and the left hand had the melody singing all throughout. This next one is a kind of a shorter piece of Wiggins called Water in the Moonlight. And you can hear that there's water in the style that he writes this in because it's in the meter of 3, which sort of swings back and forth almost like if we were canoeing or if we were, doing something where we have to go back from one side to the other like that. So this is a small character piece by Thomas Wiggins called Water in the Moonlight.
What enchanting, beautiful harmonies. Back to the story. During his Philadelphia concerts in 1886, Tom studied 2 piano concertos with Amelia Toutine, who was a student of Liszt. When describing his playing, she said it was, quote, expressive and for the most part very accurate. He never seemed to forget and could play such pieces as Sonata Pathétique with surprising skill. His playing was by no means a mirroring of the playing of others. He put in his own expression and exhibited much individuality. Tom played well, and even better than many white contemporary pianists who made great pretensions and who took years to learn what Tom could learn in a few hours. For her, the most unbelievable feat had been when, after she taught him the solo part of the Beethoven Third Piano Concerto, he, quote, turned his back to the keyboard and played the entire concerto standing in that position, meaning that his right hand played the left hand part and his left hand played the right hand part, end quote. In spite of her own assertions about Tom's exceptional musicianship and unbelievable learning ability, Madame Toutine echoed the opinion of many of the day that Tom was, quote, only a few degrees from the animal, end quote. Madame Toutine's attitude about the superiority of the white race caused her to directly contradict her musical assessment of Tom's talent and reflected the bias of many. Her bias was the status quo of the day. Unfortunately, this caused her and others to make stereotypical assumptions and diminish Tom's skills. Although Tom sustained a career that spanned 50 years, Thomas Green Wiggins lived a life filled with controversy and exploitation due to white supremacy. Blind Tom earned hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Bethunes, worth millions in the 21st century, but his last days were spent with him subsisting on charity. He performed for years until his health began to deteriorate. Tom suffered a stroke and partial paralysis in 1904, which essentially ended his career. He died in 1908 at the age of 59 after suffering from another major stroke. I would like to make some concluding remarks before Kyle performs the finale. Thomas Wiggins was truly a gifted individual with unique talent, facing multiple challenges. But he rose above these challenges and produced a body of work that lives on today. In reading about Tom, I discovered the names of many accomplished Black musicians that I had never heard before. For example, internationally acclaimed pianist Philippa Duke Schuyler. Her debut as a composer-pianist came at the age of 15 when she performed the Saint-Saëns G minor concerto with the New York Philharmonic. This was followed by her orchestra piece entitled Rumpelstiltskin. She performed in over 75 countries while in her 20s, before royalty and commoners alike. Her life came to a tragic end when she perished in a helicopter crash while helping evacuate several Vietnamese orphans from a Catholic school in Da Nang, South Vietnam. What an incredibly fascinating story. I would love to know more about her life. Hazel Harrison is another internationally acclaimed Black concert pianist. Hazel showed musical talent at an early age and appeared with leading symphony orchestras during her career. In 1904, she was invited to play at the Royal Theatre in Berlin, Germany. There, she studied with famed pianist Ferruccio Busoni, gave recitals, and performed several concertos with the Berlin Philharmonic. She was a noted artist teacher at the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, and Alabama A&M University, while continuing to perform throughout this country and in Europe. Both of these women had illustrious careers and were recognized by their contemporaries for possessing exceptional gifts. Unfortunately, their accomplishments, like so many others, have largely been lost to history, and the implications of sexism and racism are hard to ignore. While this presentation is not about Philippa or Hazel, they are examples of the wealth of undiscovered treasure and talent yet to be brought into the mainstream. In conclusion, I would like to say that blind Tom Wiggins was truly a gifted individual with unique talent, and there will never be another Thomas Green Wiggins. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation. Now, before we hear Battle of Manassas, we want to highlight some things that you should listen for. Tom uses various sound effects to simulate cannon shots and imitate sounds of a train and its whistle. The score instructs the pianist to represent cannon fire at various points by striking as many notes as possible with as much force as possible at the base of the piano. The use of tone clusters and similar effects would not be introduced again by composers until the early 20th century, almost 50 years later. Kyle, can you please explain what tone clusters are and give us a little demo?
Yes, I would love to, actually. A tone cluster is when we combine a lot of notes on the piano at the same time. So we could do this with two hands. It's basically like how a child would play the piano, where they just kind of take as many notes as they can and just smush them underneath their hands. And, it's interesting because Thomas Wiggins was actually quite young when he wrote this next piece, Battle of Manassas. He was only 12 years old. And he came up with all of these ideas that are very, as you said, kind of forward for his time. And, he was just, you can imagine, kind of like a kid at the piano that was just kind of creating these effects that he was hearing all around him. And in this particular section where we'll hear the tone clusters, we can hear them in the lower register of the piano. They're here to imitate a cannon. So we take as many notes as we can, black and white all together, and we swoosh them down really heavy like this.
Whew, that's very shocking and jarring, and that puts me right on the battlefield. Cannons, my gosh. I felt it. So now Kyle will close out with the Battle of Manassas. Such a fun piece. I really was delighted the first time that I heard this music. And I liked what Kyle said about it being very playful and childlike. I definitely think that, yes, just, we think of children as being joyous and kind of, yes, boundless, endless imagination. And that certainly evoked all of those things for me, and still does whenever I hear this piece. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us here today and taking some time to hear about this incredible musician who had, what's not a fairy tale story. It's truly indicative of a lot of the pain and, historical. It feels like an understatement to say challenges, but, challenges that people grew up with in that era. And so I do think that it is exceptional that he was still able, his talent was so undeniable that even as a slave who was blind and couldn't be used in the field, so to speak, his value was still seen, and he was noted by all who, it was undeniable. So thank you again. Kyle and I enjoyed doing this so much for you today, and we will happily take any questions that you have over on Zoom.